Airports are places of constant movement where people from every corner of the world collide in brief, chaotic bursts of humanity. Most of the time travelers are too consumed by their own worries to notice much about the people around them. But every so often, an encounter unfolds that shocks everyone nearby and reveals just how much bias can still poison ordinary moments. On one flight, a black man boarding quietly became the target of suspicion from a fellow passenger who demanded he be removed. The plane grew tense as whispers spread. Then with one calm motion he revealed something that turned the entire situation upside down. It was a busy afternoon at one of the largest airports in the United States, the kind of day where delays piled up, security lines dragged on, and travelers wore the exhaustion of schedules slipping out of their control. Families huddled around gates trying to keep children entertained. Business professionals sat hunched over laptops, answering last-minute emails before boarding. Retirees clutched coffee cups and magazines, hoping for a smooth ride. Amid all this bustle, a tall black man in his late 30s moved with measured calm through the terminal. He carried a slim leather briefcase, walked with the kind of posture that suggested both discipline and patience, and wore a simple navy blazer over a pressed shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just neat and composed. He had arrived early, cleared security without issue, and now waited quietly for the call to board. He was traveling alone, heading across the country for a meeting he had kept deliberately vague when mentioning it to strangers. To anyone watching, he appeared like any other professional on a business trip. Yet as boarding began and passengers lined up by group number, a small crack in the usual flow appeared. A woman, middle-aged with neatly styled hair and a pearl necklace resting above her blouse, glanced at him repeatedly. Her eyes darted between her boarding pass and his presence in line. At first it looked like idle curiosity, but soon her expression tightened into unease. She whispered to her husband, who stood stiffly beside her. He looked too, then shifted his stance. They were clearly uncomfortable, though nothing about the man gave reason for alarm. He didn't fidget, didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge their stares. When the line began to move, the woman hesitated, then approached the gate agent with an urgent whisper. The agent's brows rose slightly as she listened. Behind them, other passengers started to notice the tension. Some leaned closer trying to hear, others rolled their eyes at the hold-up. The black man remained silent, patiently waiting, but the whispers at the desk grew into longer exchanges. A few heads turned, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. The woman stepped back, visibly flustered but determined. She tugged her husband's sleeve and gestured toward the man in the blazer. The husband crossed his arms, nodding in agreement. The gate agent looked uncertain. Then the announcement came: boarding would continue as scheduled, but security might be asked to verify a concern raised by another passenger. The air thickened. People who had been restless now stood in complete attention. What was happening here? Why was one man suddenly under scrutiny? Unbeknownst to the crowd, a storm of injustice was about to unfold inside that narrow aluminum tube we call an airplane, where proximity magnifies every act of prejudice and every moment of courage. The boarding tunnel echoed with rolling suitcases and shuffled feet as passengers stepped into the plane. The black man, still calm, followed his assigned group. He found his seat by the window near the middle of the aircraft. He placed his briefcase under the seat, adjusted his jacket, and settled in. For a brief moment it seemed like everything might pass quietly. But just as the last few passengers were boarding, the same woman who had whispered to the gate agent appeared again. She stopped in the aisle, staring at him with open suspicion. Her voice carried louder now, directed toward the nearest flight attendant. She insisted that something was wrong, that this man looked out of place, that she did not feel safe sitting near him. The flight attendant's smile froze, caught between professionalism and disbelief. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some frowned at the woman's behavior, while others tilted their heads as though trying to decide whether they should also be suspicious. The flight attendant spoke in calm tones, reminding her that all passengers had been screened and cleared by security. But the woman shook her head, her pearl necklace trembling as she raised her voice further. She wanted him removed from the plane. She claimed she had a right to feel safe, that she was only speaking up because no one else would. By now, the entire section of the aircraft had fallen silent. Eyes darted between the accused man and the indignant woman. Tension vibrated through the cabin like static before a storm. The man sat still, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. He did not defend himself, did not argue, did not even raise his voice. That silence spoke volumes. Whispers spread down the rows. Some passengers shook their heads, whispering about unfairness, while others wondered quietly if the woman knew something they didn't. In that silence, prejudice found room to grow. Fear is contagious, and the woman's escalating tone threatened to infect the entire plane. The flight attendant excused herself to speak with the captain. Meanwhile, the woman now had allies. Her husband stood beside her, nodding firmly, repeating that they would not feel comfortable flying with that man on board. Another passenger chimed in hesitantly, saying maybe it was better to check. The atmosphere twisted into a quiet trial by suspicion. When the captain appeared at the front, the cabin grew even stiller. He was composed, authoritative, and tried to de-escalate. He explained to the woman that the passenger in question had passed all required checks. But the woman pressed harder, her voice rising, claiming she feared for the safety of everyone on board. At this point, several passengers rolled their eyes or muttered frustrations. Others crossed their arms, silent but curious. The accused man simply sat still. The captain turned to him at last, asking politely if he would be willing to show identification to resolve the matter. A murmur ran through the cabin. Some passengers cringed at the idea that he alone had to prove his right to sit in the seat he had paid for. Yet others leaned forward eagerly, waiting to see what would happen. The man reached slowly into his jacket pocket. Every eye followed his movement. He pulled out a small leather wallet and opened it with measured precision. Inside gleamed an official badge that caught the overhead light. The letters stamped on it were unmistakable, FBI. For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy. The woman froze, her mouth slightly open. Her husband's posture collapsed from rigid defiance to nervous shifting. The captain's eyes flickered with recognition. The surrounding passengers exhaled almost in unison, as though the cabin itself had been holding its breath. The balance of power in that space shifted instantly. What had been framed as suspicion now looked like baseless prejudice laid bare before dozens of witnesses. And in that charged atmosphere, the weight of shame began to settle. The silence after the badge reveal was unlike anything else. It wasn't relief, it wasn't applause, it was raw recognition of truth. In one gesture, the man had exposed the ugliness of what had just unfolded. The woman who had insisted he was a threat now stood trembling in disbelief. She tried to form words, but none came out. Her husband looked away, his face flushed red, unwilling to meet the eyes of anyone around him. The captain cleared his throat and thanked the passenger for his cooperation. He assured him that everything was in order, that there was never any doubt about his legitimacy to be on board. But the words rang hollow. Everyone knew what had just happened. It wasn't about protocol, it was about prejudice. A paying customer had been singled out, accused, and shamed solely because of the color of his skin. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably, the reality settling over them. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed that they had even considered the woman's accusations credible. Others stared openly at her, silently demanding accountability. The woman finally muttered something about misunderstanding, about only trying to protect her fellow travelers. But no one believed her excuses. They had witnessed the venom in her voice, the certainty in her tone, the satisfaction she had carried before the badge was revealed. The man remained calm, his badge now tucked away. He did not gloat, did not lecture, did not even smirk. He simply returned to his seat, embodying a dignity that made the accusations against him look even smaller. In contrast, the woman's stature seemed to shrink. She and her husband were guided to their seats, their earlier arrogance replaced by silence. The rest of the cabin carried on boarding, but an invisible shift had taken place. Everyone knew they had just witnessed a confrontation far larger than one passenger's prejudice. They had seen bias stripped bare, exposed under the harsh light of truth, and they could not unsee it. The flight eventually took off, the roar of engines filling the cabin as the plane lifted into the sky. But the atmosphere remained unusual. People whispered less, moved slower, glanced often at the man by the window. Some carried guilt, others respect, still others awe at the quiet strength he had shown. The woman who had tried to expel him sat stiffly in her seat, her eyes fixed forward, her pearl necklace no longer a symbol of composure but of fragile pretension. She knew every glance around her carried judgment. Hours passed as the plane cut through the skies. The man remained composed, reviewing papers from his briefcase, jotting notes, sipping water. To him this was just another day, another flight, another example of bias confronted and dissolved by patience. To everyone else it had become a story they would carry with them long after landing. When the plane touched down and passengers filed into the aisle, several quietly nodded to him, small gestures of acknowledgement and respect. No words were exchanged, but the meaning was clear. They had seen both cruelty and dignity in action. They had seen fear collapse when faced with truth. As he walked through the terminal and disappeared into the crowd, the question remained heavy in the minds of those who had witnessed it. How many times had similar injustices played out where the truth wasn't revealed by a badge or a title? How many ordinary travelers, without symbols of authority to shield them, had been forced to endure humiliation in silence? This was more than a story about one man on one flight. It was a reminder of how fragile fairness can be when prejudice is allowed to guide suspicion. It was proof that dignity can be more powerful than anger, and that sometimes the most powerful statement is made without a single word. And so the memory lingered, not just as an awkward incident on a plane, but as a quiet indictment of bias that continues to shape daily life. Each passenger left with the challenge to reflect, what would they have done if the badge had not been there to silence the lies?